All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Before beginning, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional, unsurrendered land of the Anishinaabe, and we acknowledge our position as guests. We pay respect to the First Peoples and original custodians of this land, from whose vibrant creative life we have much to learn. Thank you all for being here. This is the last lecture of this year's forum series, and I'm Janine Debonnet, and I teach at the Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism, and I helped organize this year's series titled Common Cause, where we've explored many facets of architecture as agent of social and environmental change. It's my true privilege to introduce Billie Tsien this evening, a person I've admired my whole career. To walk through a William Tsien building is, to borrow tonight's lecture title, to look, feel, and listen. William Tsien's works, many of which were completed for institutions, are built to last. What is more, they honor their visitors through supremely attentive design and materiality. William Tsien's buildings leave a deep imprint on embodied experience and memory. And I know this from experience. When I was teaching in my early career in Detroit in the 1990s, I would take students to visit her beautifully made natatorium at Cranbrook. And during a study trip with Carleton students in 2014 with my colleague Ben Gianni, we had the privilege of visiting the Asia Society Hong Kong Center, a work of profound architectural poetry encrusted into a hill. Born to parents who had left China to pursue graduate studies at Cornell at a time when leaving China meant indefinitely severing ties, or for many, many decades, Billie grew up in Ithaca and then New Jersey. She would have to wait till adulthood to visit her extended family in Shanghai. Billie shared with me that she was an extremely shy child, a bookworm, who felt the call of art at a very early age. To this day, art and words are her creative partners. I quote, a few words or a small sketch that have nothing to do with architecture per se provide her project's beginnings. After completing an undergraduate major in painting and printmaking at Yale University, Billie embarked on her studies in architecture at UCLA. She is a founding partner of the New York-based practice Todd Williams Billie Tsien Architects and has completed a wide range of projects for nonprofit, cultural, and academic institutions. Always exquisitely conceived and constructed, their projects have garnered numerous awards, including the National Medal of Arts from President Obama, the 2013 AIA Architecture Firm Award, and in 2019, the Japan Art Association's Imperial Prize. Billie also teaches at Yale. Involved in community, she serves as the first woman and Asian American chair of the Commission of Fine Arts, appointed by President Biden in 2021. Throughout this forum, we've considered affordability, sustainability, and tonight Billie will offer yet another side of, or another approach to architecture's common cause, architecture as a sensuous offering in which to live. I quote her here, architecture is part of a web of connections with other people trying to make beauty, trying to solve problems. Architecture is not a world unto itself. It is a world that is sort of like a star amidst a constellation. With no further ado, please welcome Billie Tsien.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here. I told my friend Jennifer Luce when I landed, I felt as if the tension level sort of dropped. So I feel very, oops, a little bit of feedback here. Stand further away. I feel very lucky to be here. I'm going to go through a number of projects, and I think what the topic is thinking about public space. What is public space? And I think more and more in our work, we've wanted to focus on public space. But I'm a very private person. So I grew up, as Janine said, in New Jersey. and I was the only Asian person in the community, and where I always say I feel culturally very American. So all of my references, everything I read, music, it's all very American, but psychologically I'm very Chinese. So when I get angry, I get really quiet. And the angrier I am, the quieter I am. And it lasts for a really, really long time. So I've always, you start to think when you go to architecture school that there's the straight road, and the road leads, to the end, and you become a practicing architect and you build buildings. But actually, I think architecture, in a good way, is much more about tangents. And especially now, I think architecture school doesn't necessarily lead to that sort of straight end where you practice in a very traditional way. It starts to spin off, and there are a lot of other ways that an architectural education, and I'm saying this to the students out there, can inform you about thinking about a greater world. So it's not a narrowing, it's a widening. But I wanted to talk about the private part. So I've thought a lot about interiority and about this sense of the inside and what that means for the outside. This is actually an ideas competition that I did 1 million years ago. And this is Columbus Circle in New York City. And it's the tip of Central Park. There's Central Park West running up along one side and Broadway running down the other. And so it's a kind of area where roads cross. And it's called Columbus Circle. And so they said, make a monument for Columbus Circle. And my idea for making that monument was to dig a hole to China, because that's what Columbus was looking for anyway. And when I was growing up, I could never see my grandparents. I didn't know them. So as a child, this idea, if you could just dig it deep enough, you would end up in China, really amazed me. So my idea was to dig a hole to China. But once again, it's not about making something go up. It's not about something that's present. It's about something that goes down and that is invisible. And I was lucky enough to travel to Ethiopia. And I was very, very moved by the rock-hewn churches in Lalibela. So these churches are carved out of solid rock. And what they did was they carved down. They isolated the stone, and then they carved from inside to the outside. For me, they're one of the most powerful pieces of architecture that I've ever seen. And it is both about it's invisible from above, but it has great, great power when you get down to the bottom. So it's both an interior space, deeply interior, and an exterior space. So Augustine is spelled wrong. I am the grammar person in the office, so when I see spelling mistakes, it really bothers me. I'm going to go back and say, you made a mistake. Anyway, I'm very interested in the insides, and I've always said that when I start to design, I always design from the inside out. So it's about interiority. And I don't know whether kids in Canada grow up with this book, Goodnight Moon, but it is a classic, and it's what every parent uses to try to put their kids to sleep. But it goes around the room, and it recounts all of these details about the room. And I love this book because it starts to tell the character of the bunny by all the things that are in the bunny's room. And then I was in Venice, and I saw this painting by Vittore Carpaccio. And I thought, why does this painting look familiar? And it seemed to me that it was very related to Goodnight Moon, because it's got the red and the green, and it has a series of objects in it which start to tell about St. Augustine. And so there's an astrolabe in the back of the room, and it says, this is a man of science. and culture. But there's also a little white dog in the room, which says that this is a very humane man and one who not only loves animals but has a connection to animals. So the details to me tell very, very much about the occupant. So let's see. I'm very, very interested in details. This is the home of a woodworker. He's a sculptor, but he also made furniture, named Wharton Esherick. And it's in Pennsylvania. We visited it, and there was this most amazing stair, which was a spiral wooden stair that he had made, but it goes partway down, and then you can go back up and go to a sort of middle floor. And I remember walking down the stair and holding the railing, which was wood, and then suddenly the railing was the same color, but it was a different temperature. And I looked at it, and I was trying to figure out why it was a different temperature. Why did it feel suddenly cool? And I realized it was an elephant tusk that had been let into the wood. And the tusk had turned the same color brown, but it had a very different thermal temperature to it. And it was a reminder, in architecture, there are the things, of course, that we see. There's the physical space that we move through, but there are all those other senses that we, as architects, can change or think about. So, even just the sense of touch and the temperature of the material is something that's very interesting. And I don't know about you, but I love the smell of concrete. And when you go into, even in the crummiest sort of concrete stairway, there's this sort of dusty smell that smells like concrete. And so architecture also has a smell. So this idea of detail even doesn't need to always be apparent, but it reveals itself in other ways. So this image is from a tailor shop in Rome, where this man was making a jacket for somebody. And the sort of beautiful stitching is the tailoring inside the shoulder of the jacket. And then eventually the lining will cover it, so you'll never see it. But there's this sense of caring about beauty, even when you won't probably ever be able to see it. And this also translates into work that I've done. So working with the Noguchi Foundation, I did a traveling exhibit of Noguchi lamps. And everybody knows them because they're so iconic. But I thought it would be more interesting to put them behind plexiglass screens that it was actually not plexiglass, it was cast resin, and show just the shape of the light before you saw the object of the light. So you would walk around the screen and you would see the object of the light, but before you knew that, you just saw the shape. So this sense of, in some way, withholding, but then opening up, has also influenced architecture from our studio. So this is the facade of the Folk Art Museum, which no longer exists, but is a museum that was very much focused on materials that were made by untrained artists. So the facade itself was cast from panels, one after one, that were sand cast panels. So the metal was poured as molten metal on top of sand, and then, however, the sand was pockmarked, the panels would then pick up that marking. So it was very much, again, about the sense of sort of touch, and a reminder that these things are not made always by machines, that they're made by hand. So what are a few ideas, or I guess maybe it's not ideas, approaches that always are part of the work? And so, as I said, one of them is to begin inside. Another one is to really try to honor the land. And I think our buildings always try very much to fit themselves into the land. And one of the things I saw students today was thinking about how your buildings start to either sit into the land and make space. So the land is also something, it's not simply a surface upon which you put a building. It's the sort of a kind of nesting. You need to always nest your buildings into the land, and in that way understand and honor the topography that is natural. I think in the past, there's been the culture of a kind of the starchitect, and that it is sort of one person who makes all things happen. And we all know, both in studio and school, but particularly anybody who practices, it's not about a person. It's about many people, and it's about collaboration. And finally, it's to be of service. So when I was in art school, I felt frustrated because I never knew what I should be doing, because you're supposed to make up your own problem when you're an artist. And in many ways, then you sort of solve the problem that you made up, and then you decide whether it's good or bad. The great thing that architecture does is it gives you somebody else's problem, and gives you that problem to solve, and also to hopefully solve it in a way that is not in any way, transcends the solution. So it's one of the truly wonderful things about architecture is that it's somebody else's problem, and that we are honored to be of service. And then finally, to keep asking questions. So sometimes we're forced to keep asking questions, but I think it's one of the reasons why this is a profession that continues to be interesting. Really, you know, most architects pretty much try to practice until they drop dead. And it's because the questions are always there, and they keep you going. You're always following the answers. So this is a very ancient project, but I was trying to think about what are public projects. And so this was a kind of art project, and it was on a sort of very steep ski slope in Italy. And there were a number of different architects that were paired with artists, so you can see the names up at the top. And we were paired with a person named Karsten Haller, and the project is that ellipse, which is number 4. And so this was a really rough sketch, but the idea was that we would make a sledding hill that would be a sort of very controlled sledding hill, and it's all made out of snow. So we worked with sort of snow engineers. And in the end, it became a kind of trapezoid shape with holes where you would slide down and end up coming out the holes at the bottom. So there are big holes at the top. You'd sit in the sled, you'd go through the hole. Thank God I didn't know about liability insurance then, because that was the early days. So the model, and then as it was built in on the ski slope, and then people coming in from the top and sliding down to the bottom. There are a few people who kind of went over the edge and kept on going down, but so that was a very early attempt at trying to make something that was public, trying to make something that was fun. And then this is a later project, which is in Prospect Park in Brooklyn. So this image shows Central Park, and it's both Central Park and Prospect Park were designed by Olmsted and Box. So they are the gods of public spaces. But public parks are truly the most democratic spaces. So there are a lot of places in New York City now that are deemed public, but my feeling is unless you can go there and, let's say, spread a picnic blanket out and eat a peanut butter sandwich in the middle of this public space, then it's not really public space. So people in Brooklyn say that Olmsted and Box practiced on Central Park so they could make Prospect Park a better park. It's a little bit smaller, but it's much more topographically interesting. So this is from their early drawings, and they had a turnaround for a carriage. There was the Prospect Park Lake, and then there was something called Concert Grove, and then there was a little island. And the idea was that musicians would supposedly come and play in the island, and you would sit and picnic and listen to the concerts. And people at that time, and I know this is also happening with your canal where you can't skate on it so much, but people at that time were able to skate on the ice in the lake. By the late 60s, Robert Moses had taken the carriage turnaround. He was a big planner in New York City, and turned it into a parking lot. And then the area which was Music Island was filled in, and there was an indoor skating rink. Skating was starting to fail, and it was a big sort of power suck. So here you can see where the Concert Grove sort of dead ends into the 60s rink. So what we did working with the Prospect Park Conservancy is to rehabilitate the edge of the water, renew Music Island, and then put a new skating rink in the area where the parking lot used to be. And there are two rinks. One is an outdoor uncovered rink, and the other one is for ice hockey. So I know that you think we're not important ice hockey players, but there's the Brooklyn teams who like to play ice hockey, and they also do, what is that thing with the? Curling. They do that thing, curling thing. So we're trying to make this a quiet building in the park and not really realize it as a building. So what you see from the park is primarily this big canopy. And the buildings are built into the ground. So the ground was cut, and then the buildings were built, and then earth was brought on top of the buildings. So you don't see them as separate buildings standing out. So as you approach the rink, there are walls that are made from the same sort of granite schist that's used on walls throughout Central Park. And these are really the berms that start to cover the buildings that are underneath. And so you can walk up on top of the berms from both sides and not necessarily know that you're going to see a skating rink. There are two buildings that are connected by a bridge. And then as you enter, there's this long tile mural, which is sort of standard tile, but moving from a kind of spring, summer, fall, winter. And then we looked at the patterns for figure skating on ice and very loosely translated them to the ceiling. So the ceiling shows these marks, and the marks are carved out of a foam and essentially spray painted white, silver. So we had wanted to put lights in there, but it was too expensive, but realized when the ice is there, the ice is a big reflector, so it can just reflect the silver of the ceiling. And then there are lights that are in a straight line that are turned on when hockey is being played. And when it's free skating at night, the lights that are sort of scattered all over are turned on. So there's two ways of lighting the space. And in the summertime, it becomes roller skating. And we feel, you do have to rent skates or rent ice skates if you don't have them, but otherwise it's a free facility. And the outside ice skating area also becomes water play. So it's part of the public park system of Brooklyn. And there you can see Prospect Lake beyond. I think I'm gonna, this is, so trying to think about, we drove past the American Embassy, and it was just so hard because I know it took away your streets. There's bollards there, there's fences there. There's a very big issue with all, as you can imagine, embassies, and particularly American embassies, with security. So we got this project and we tried to think about how can we make this building feel less present in the neighborhood. It's pretty hard to make it feel less present because it's a huge thing. But one of the important things we tried to do is push it down into the ground. And I think that goes back to this idea of somehow honoring the earth. So it's trying to use the ground, push the building into the ground so its scale is somewhat smaller. So Mexico City is a huge city. It's actually very green, so there are parks that run through it, and it's very temperate. So it's high elevation, so it can be quite cool in the evenings. It's a city that feels on its outside edges quite solid and hard. If anybody's been to Mexico City, or really any of Mexican City, that there's a boundary between public and private. But inside, and these are all the courtyards, courtyards play have huge importance in both the social life and the family life and the civic life of Mexico. And so seeing all these courtyards, we felt that it was very, very important to make sure that our project had a lot of courtyards. It's also because it's so defended as a building. We had to have windows that were 4 inches thick glass to be bomb-proof. We had to have structure that was double the structure so that if there was an explosion, the secondary structure would hold up the building. We had to have mechanical systems that were double the mechanical systems, so if one system was contaminated, another system came on. So we had to have 16-foot high walls through which you could not see and around which you could have no trees and nothing growing because they didn't want people to climb up. So within the confines of that incredible sense of need for security, we tried to think about how to make buildings that took advantage of the courtyard idea. So they asked for different ideas. So one was a taller building, but that had a garden. The other one was on grade. It was a series of outdoor plazas. But the one we went with was one that was lower, was depressed into the ground, and was based on a series of courtyards. So this is a kind of view where you're starting to look at the courtyards and the openings. So it is very much a building that has courtyards that are set 2 stories below grade, as well as courtyards that are set 1 story below grade, as well as courtyards that are set on the upper levels. So it's trying to be as porous as it can be. So here you see that the grade is at the far right. This is people walking in from the street, and it goes down 2 floors. The primary floor is a piano nobile, which is underneath that courtyard. So we're trying to lift up the main floor. So you're either going down 3 floors or you're going up 3 floors. So it doesn't feel as if you're starting from the bottom and going all the way to the top. But there's a lot of sun load in Mexico City, although it's cool. So we also were working with this idea of a roof that had openings, but the openings had to be able to deliver rain and sunshine to the courtyards down below. So there are a number of roof studies that we did. And this is a rendering of the building. It's probably got another 1.5 years to go. And this is one of the much, much lower courtyards. And we were looking at different kinds of stone, both a Mexican travertine and a sandstone. And we ended up using a sandstone because it was warm and it was closer to the color of a lot of the buildings of Mexico, which are sort of Mexico City, which are sort of buff or kind of a salmon color. And here you can see the color of the stone as it's being applied to the outside of the building. It's, as I said, a very solid building, so it's cast-in-place concrete. And this is the area where people, both American citizens and Mexican citizens, will enter. So that is a plaza at ground level. So going back to this idea of detail and the inside, there's a very beautiful hotel in Mexico City by Legarreta. And there's a piece by an artist named Matthias Goritz. And he actually also worked with Barragan on Barragan's house. And he did this piece of a kind of punctured metal. And it's just very beautiful in the way it captures the light. So thinking about this idea of a punctured metal, we worked on a screen. And the screen is in part a sunscreen, but it's also because this is primarily a humongous office building, and all of the windows are the same. And so we didn't want to show the windows as a sort of continuous window after window. So we were both making a sunscreen, particularly to the Western light, but we're also sort of going back maybe to Folk Art Museum and making a kind of facade that was in front of the other facade. So it was quite complex, and it's made from pieces of metal that are cast and pieces of metal that are folded and bent. So they're different colors of metal. And we're also canting the view. So the metal above goes like this, the metal bars below go like this, because it's actually hard to look up to the sky, and you have a better view when you're sort of looking down. This is it being cast, so they actually cast this in Istanbul. The contractors are an amalgam of Turkish and American contractors. And then this is also going back to what we did at Folk Art, so that there's some of the metal panels that are cast are combined with the metal panels which are bent and folded. So this is quite shiny, but it's aging, so it's going to be much more sort of brown tone by the time it's done. So there's the issue of walls. And as I said, we have to have a 16-foot tall wall outside of the embassy. And as we drove by the American embassy with its bollards and its things, I said, well, at least they got to have a wall that you could see through, because now the rules are that you can't see through the walls. But Mexico has this amazing history of walls, because its streets are walled streets. So this is a very long elevation of the wall that we have to have. But we wanted to make it feel more alive. So by using a cast concrete, but casting the sandstone into the concrete and also casting basalt small panels, it becomes a sort of more of a tapestry wall. And this was a mock-up. And here we were looking at different small colored stones being placed into the spaces between the large pieces of sandstone. But in the end, we decided to just go with the black ones. So it's the black, the sandstone, and the concrete. We also looked at things like the tile floors in Mexico, which are incredibly beautiful, and the tiles are made in Mexico. So this is what we used in the bathrooms. This is a very standard Mexican pattern. So this is one of the bathrooms. And then we also looked at the very rich colors in both Mexican architecture, Mexican clothing, Mexican paintings, and working with a felt producer, made these very long panels with these big blocks of color. So the hallways, you can imagine this building just go on and on. So rather than having painted sheetrock, it's going to be covered with these felt panels with these colors that actually are just made so that if you have to cut a door through some of the colors, you cut the door through the colors, but the panels just go on. And then looking at some Mexican textiles, taking that pattern and having it reproduced in small tiles as mosaics on the floor of the dining room. So this is actually the last project I'm going to show, and it's under construction, and we've got another 2 years to go. It says 2025, but that's optimistic. So this was actually a competition, and 7 firms were chosen to compete, and we really hate competitions because we never win competitions. We always either do too much or we don't make the kind of big statement, because buildings sort of become buildings over time when they're developed, and competition is just trying to make something often that it's hard to believe in. So we tried to, in the beginning, just talk about ideas and not about buildings. And then we chose these words, enable and ennoble. And Janine was talking, I was saying to Janine, often we start out with a small sketch or with words because they help us think about architecture without being about form or about being architecture itself. So we felt that the presidency of President Obama really ennobled that position in the United States. And we felt also that what he did and what he is doing now with this presidential center is to enable other people. So that's a photograph of him when he was very young in Chicago doing community organizing. And then we had these images. So everybody else, I think, was probably making, I know they were making very architectural drawings, but that's what we showed. And we said, this building will be about storytelling because you have to tell the story of the 8 years of the presidency, but it will also be about story making because the focus of the building is an educational center where people from Chicago, from the United States, from the rest of the world will come and learn about how to actively be involved in civic engagement, how to be good citizens wherever they are so that they can maybe make the world feel like a better place. We also said, had this diagram, it's not about a singular building, it's about a campus. And that campus, in many ways, is much more democratic because a single building you feel like you need permission to go into. But if it's a campus, then people can walk around even if they have not planning to go into the building at all. So there were 2 sites, and this is in Chicago. North of the Midway Plaisance is the University of Chicago, and now it's starting to bridge to the south of the Plaisance. But south of the Plaisance is the south side of Chicago, and that's where Michelle Obama grew up. So we had to make a proposal for Washington Park, Jackson Park. Jackson Park is actually adjacent to Lake Michigan, so it's close. You know, there are series in Chicago. The major museums happen along the parks along Lake Michigan. So this was our our original idea for the competition. And you can see that there are really 3 buildings, a roof garden, the other yellow square, and then there's like a purple square with water around it. And we took our ideas from Brooklyn Bridge, from Brooklyn's Prospect Park, and brought the land up on top of the buildings so that you would be able to walk along on the park side and you would see the buildings, but you wouldn't actually understand that this was a complex of buildings because you could walk on top of the buildings. So this was our competition entry, and it also shows, at that time we thought that there was actually going to be a library there, so that's what's in orange. But he was our first digital president, so a library of papers didn't make sense because it's all been digitized and most of the material was digital anyway, so it's not about papers in bankers' boxes in cold storage in a room. So that part has disappeared, but what we did do is we buried the library and changed the topography. And that's also thinking a little bit about Olmsted and Vaux, because they didn't just work with the flat land. They actually sculpted and made a topography both in Central Park and in Prospect Park. So this was our presentation. This was a kind of general idea about being under a kind of oculus with natural light. We took pictures of people in our studio and had them wear these t-shirts. So the idea was it was kind of like an Apple store where people would be helping you. And then looking out through one side of the building opens up, and actually below it was the idea of the library. On top of it was a sledding hill. And then this was an idea of a very special space which would be above water, which would be a communal meeting space. So we were chosen, and it was amazing. And we started to meet about the design. And the criticism was that our buildings were too quiet and they weren't iconic enough. And like, what does that even mean? Because I don't believe you design things to be iconic. I believe they become iconic if they deserve to be iconic. So suddenly, all of this stuff that we've been saying about designing from the inside out, and it's quiet and sitting in the land, it's like, okay, what does iconic mean? So we once again went back to images or thoughts. One's certainly this idea of a lantern lighting a way, and the other is many hands coming together. So we tried to make the building more vertical, and this was an early attempt, and they said it was too squat and not iconic enough. And so he said, okay, what can we do? In the meantime, we worked with Michael van Valkenburg on this idea of the park, which covers the buildings. And there's now a branch of the Chicago Public Library, which is there. And on top of it is a productive garden, which will grow vegetables and teach people about gardening. Below grade, the building is all one building, but above grade, at the plaza level, it's 3 buildings. So we had these 3 buildings: public library. The center building is called the Winter Garden and Forum, so it's totally open to all people. So you don't have to pay to go there. There's an auditorium, a cafe, and just a place to sit and hang out. And then the taller building is where the museum is going to be, and at the very top will be something that's called a sky room. Uniting it all is a plaza. So this was another sketch, still not considered iconic, but you can see that there are sunken courtyards that go down, bring light to the lower level, and to both people working and going to classrooms down there. So it's also going back to this cutting down into the ground and then bringing the earth on top. So we were at really wit's end, and we just started making shapes, and then we gave names to the shapes, and one was the hip shape, which was like here, one was the waist shape, one was the pitch shape, and then the other one was light at the top. And then we made a lot of models. So it was a very interesting exercise in a way of designing, which we never do and probably will never do again. But it was also, I think, a good thing in that we have a tendency, and I've written about this, to move slowly, and so we needed to move quickly and just sort of make these shapes one after another. But in the end, one was chosen, and I think that they felt good about this building. It's a taller building. It's 268 feet tall, and at the very top is a screen, which I will explain in a minute. So President Obama said he would have been an architect if he hadn't gone into community organizing and become a president. Anybody who's an architect who has had a client who comes in and says that they've always wanted to be an architect, you know what I mean. It's not a good thing. It's not a good thing. So I have to say, he had many good ideas, but these were like those little rounded things and stuff, those were his marks. And he said, well, what do you think about this idea? It's like, But he did have many good ideas. And one of the things he said was he wanted it to be interesting and different on all sides. It's a vertical museum, which is also not a great idea. It doesn't make that much sense. But it needed to. In the end, I understood it because there will be people coming here to pay homage to the idea and the person. And so this idea, so this sense that it should be quiet and self-effacing in a way doesn't respond to the need for people to see something which they feel represents something important. So, but the body of the building is solid because it's all exhibitory, and the top, as I said, is a space that will be a public space. So we have escalators that take you up to the top. And we tried to think about what happens at the top. So it's west-facing, so once again, going to this idea of a sunscreen, and also trying to think about working the stone in a way that keeps the fabric whole, but sort of does an embroidery on it as well. This is stone from Western Massachusetts. It's called tapestry. There are two kinds of stones in that quarry, and one is called kittledge. It's much quieter. Tapestry is very, very figured, and they wanted to use an American stone. So these are tests that were done where they're looking at the different variation in the stone to make sure that the hanging will be engineered so that it acknowledges that, unlike a very consistent stone, which will have a very consistent strength, that the strength varies with the movement of the stone. And so here you can see it's a mock-up of the two stones from the same quarry, one much more figured and one much more quiet. So the lower buildings are going to be of the quieter stone. The figured stone will go on the bigger building. And then we started to look at these sort of markings that I was talking about. And we also have this sort of window that runs through the center, except that it's not really a window because we weren't allowed to bring in any natural light. But it's in a way, it's a sort of quiet beam of light going back to this idea of the lantern. So this was sort of, in the end, a little too busy, but then we started to look at whether the stone could feel, and President Obama said he was interested in Brancusi as an artist. So this sense of a kind of chiseling. And so these blocks were cut, machine cut, and then hand chiseled to break down the edges. So the screen at the top, this is actually also something that I bought when I was in Ethiopia, and it's about this big, fits in your hand. I don't even know whether it was made 3 weeks before I bought it or 100 years. Didn't make any difference because it was kind of a very magical object with these letters cut into the stone. And so the first thought was, well, maybe it's just a pattern that recalls letters, but aren't really letters at all, that will become a kind of sunscreen on the face of this building. And so these are sort of this early attempt at letters that aren't really letters, but sort of refer to words, because he was always so much a person of words. But then they decided to use the words from the speech that he gave to commemorate the March on Selma in Alabama. So those words are the words that are being used to create this screen. And here we're working with pentagrams, so we're looking at how can we start to make this into a screen. And it's interesting because in graphic design, there's something called a ligature, and those are those bars that connect the letters. And so in thinking about those bars that connect the letters, that became a way of starting to make a structure for the screen words itself. So the screen, which we actually thought was going to be carved in stone, but which was much too expensive, is being cast in concrete. It's a high-performance tensile concrete. It's being cast in panels in Virginia. And will be attached to a metal structure behind. And this is the sky room, the very top floor, and you'll be looking through the words of President Obama to the south side of Chicago, and that will be a space that will be open to all people. So the museum itself will be ticketed, but the ground floor and the top floor will be public. And I always felt like it was like being inside somebody's head, like being inside his head, because you're looking through the words. With Michael van Valkenburg, we worked to make, and he worked, I mean, he's very interested in making public spaces that have very different personalities from place to place. So it was a little hard because as architects, we kind of like a unified idea of landscape, and his was like, well, there's a playground here, or there's the woodlands here. But in the end, this is sort of not about, it's really about trying to make it enjoyable for people. This is the parking garage, which replaced the idea of the library, and it has also become, a sledding hill. So some ideas remain. This is the plaza. This is the forum, the public space at ground level. This is the entrance to the museum area. This is the lower level, which is where the classrooms will be. This is the public library, which will be open. It's a neighborhood public library. This is the farewell speech. And I kind of have to disavow this because we don't do this. We don't do fly-throughs, and I think it's kind of bullshit. However, the foundation wanted to have this, so it's a kind of fundraising tool. But you can see the extent. It's a 19-acre park. There's a lagoon, and beyond the lagoon is Lake Michigan. This is the building. It is trying to be have an interest in all sides. You can see the park on top of the existing buildings. You can see Michael van Valkenburg's kind of wild and wacky playground spaces. And then it's going to sort of zoom back in a very weird way. There's a productive garden on top of the library. And then this is the plaza. Watch out for the trees. And this is, they're actually another floor higher. So I was there last week. So it's like the embassy. It's a cast-in-place concrete building clad in stone. It also has the same security, almost the same security requirements, not the double structure and not the double mechanical system, but the windows and very, very robust construction, because he has received more threats on his life than any other president. So it's bomb-proof. Let's see. But this is my last slide. In the end, we're looking at mock-ups because I think full scale is always what tells you the truth. So, but along with the mock-ups, because there's something that you can touch with your hand, is once again not only being able to touch it with your hand and see things with your hand and understand it real scale, real life, but also appreciation of the hands and the many hands that come together to make any building, large or small, any project, large or small. It's a collaboration. It's a weave of many people. We're a fabric. We're not, an object. And with that, I thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you all today.
Thank you so much, Billie, for taking us through your process and several projects in detail. It was really, really beautiful, and just hearing how just your sensibilities around design and kind of the slow pace, and then what happens when you're being pushed to go faster. But it was very, very interesting to see that last project. I'm excited to go back to Chicago now.
Wait a while.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, and that rink, beautiful. Well, all of it. So, as always, everyone, we welcome your questions. There's time, so I've got a microphone here to bring to you, or we can repeat your question. So, are there any questions? Anyone want to break the ice? Yep. Okay. Oh, Marcus. Yeah, we could have a little bit of light.
Hi, Billy. Thank you so much for your presentation and just your presence here. I want to just go back. I'm sorry, I don't want to talk about the Folk Art Museum. These projects are stunning Mexico and Chicago projects, but the Folk Art Museum was something that really resonated with me when it was designed and built. And I wonder if you can just take 1 minute and just give people the story about what happened. And then my main question is, what's been able to be produced from the materials? Have they been saved? Have they been reused? Have you kept pieces of it in your home or your studio? Maybe you can just enlighten us a bit on that, because as a folk art museum, I think that's a relevant question.
So this is a very small museum, and I think it was less than 10 years after we made this museum, it basically went bankrupt, and they didn't have enough to pay back, I think it was $3 million loan. So the Museum of Modern Art bought it, and then they tore it down. And it was very disappointing, because I would have understood it better if it had been a developer and they were going to build some small tower on it, but the fact that it was a museum made it very disappointing. Subsequently, Villers-Scofidio Renfro did a project on that site. And the Museum of Modern Art said that they have kept the panels. Where, I do not know. I have a feeling that they kept them in a landfill in New Jersey. Because they were sort of big and they're very heavy, but they said that they kept the panels, so I really don't know where they are. It was very painful and very upsetting. But I always say to myself, it's not as important. You know, it's a building, it's not a person. And that kind of puts it all in perspective, for me anyway.
Another question? Maybe a second-year student? I see. Is there a hand up there? Oh, okay. Let's get over there.
Understand it's dinner time and you may be hungry, so anybody who wants to get up and leave, truly, I am not in any way insulted.
Oh, you're so kind. It's true. If you want to leave before or during the Q&A, because I told the second years they're very stressed. I said, you can leave during the Q&A. So, but you are very kind, and I want to say, 23 years ago, I heard you speak, and you showed the Folk Art Museum a beautiful photograph of a sectional model, and I wrote to you and said, I would love to show that to my students, and you shared the image with me, and so generations of students have seen the photograph of that model. Okay, is it Abdul over there? Okay.
Hi, thank you
Hi.
for the presentation. I just had a question regarding the screen for the Obama Presidential Center.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any struggle behind trying to say like a preference for which way the words are read? Because I think right now they're facing like the exterior, and then if you're inside, it's gonna kind of be like backwards. Was there any struggle in the design and figuring that out?
That's an interesting question. Actually, we had this idea that on the inside there should be a small metal small metal plate that would tell you what the words were from the inside. But that's one of those details that didn't actually happen. And actually, to be honest, you will not be able to stand there unless you really want to run around from side to side, because the words go like this around the corner of the building. And so I'm sure that they'll have some QR code that you can scan so that you can read it on your phone. Because in a way, it's more symbolic, and it's the idea that it's a Selma speech. And physically, it's doubtful that you could read it unless you were in a drone, you were a drone. You could see from a drone, whatever, because it's up high and it goes on two sides of the building. So call it a symbol. It's a symbol.
Based on your experience, you are mostly used to do slow projects, you said, and you got the experience of doing a fast project. And I wondered, in studio, we're used to have like big project in short span of time. And what are the lessons that you learned from the differences in approach in a project?
You know, it's an interesting question, because one of the things I was saying is you keep asking questions. And so, and a lot of people have over time mentioned the sort of slowness article. And I'm starting to think it's not about speed, but it's about being deliberate. And that it may be that we don't need to go so slowly if we can use our history of knowledge to be deliberate about our decisions. So rather than poring over things and going back over them, we can move forward. But every time we move forward, it's a very clear, deliberate step. It's kind of a different way of working, but it's also, I think, for students in school and for people who are practicing, who are having younger people come to the office, there's a very different culture now. And I, to some extent, agree with the culture, because it used to be that, you go, you throw yourself on the funeral pyre of architecture and you burn yourself to a crisp. And that's how you were somehow initiated into being an architect. And I don't feel that, I'm more than starting to feel, I think that younger people who are working are not interested in burning themselves to a crisp. They are interested in doing thoughtful, very good work. And how can we work in a way that is not ponderous but deliberate, that's thoughtful without being, without repeating things too much. So I think that's what we learn from having to do these many models, that you can start to make, I wouldn't do that again, but you can start to make these sort of decisions a little bit more quickly without having every model be the sort of precious model. It's got to be the final answer. This has got to be the final answer. But understanding that there are flaws in what you do, but then trying to be deliberate and understanding where the flaws are and then how you can improve it. That's kind of long-winded answer, but it's one of the questions that I ask about practicing now, given just the culture of architecture, which is different. I think we have I think architecture has developed in an important culture. I'm not saying we're throwing it away, but I think the way we get to the final result may be a slightly different path than it used to be. And I also think, by the way, that part of this also has to do with understanding that people have families, that men and women, and it has fallen very much on the shoulders of women, have been caretakers of families, and therefore many women have been at a certain level, at a certain time, sort of shunted or sidelined from the profession. So the profession also needs to change to understand that there is a kind of family structure and that we need to be much more open in terms of how people work and how they can work.
I think digital technologies can help us move from ponderous to, what was your word, deliberate?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I feel like you have to be quite strong and knowledgeable to be able to use a tool and not let the tool use you. So a lot of what I see in schools is students who have a power of the tool, but the tool is using them. So in that way, I think architecture is still a kind of long practice because you're going to have to understand how you are in control of the tool rather than vice versa. So when I see kids doing a rhino model of a building before they do a plan, and then the plan, I'm sorry, you guys in the back, when they take the rhino model and they slice it, boom, 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 and that's the plan, and then they slice it this way, and that's the section. The tool is using you, you're not using the tool. So yes and no. Of course, can I do any of this? The answer would be no. But I think I can see, and I think that's really important. We all need to learn to see.
Yeah, thanks so much for your incredibly compelling lecture. I really appreciated the work, and it's a remarkable body of work you've put forward. This connects a bit to what you were just saying. I was very much appreciated how at the beginning you discussed the importance of being in this moment of expanding how we think about practice. And I wondered just even on pragmatic terms what that has meant for your office in terms of the way you approach design, collaboration, new tools, any of the things that were just brought up, and how does that kind of take place behind scenes in your own practice?
So I think we're trying now to understand future, succession, what does that mean? Leadership, is it now leadership from the top, or can you lead from the center? Which I think is a very interesting idea about leading from the center. So it's not it's not a totally democratic situation, but if you're in the center and people are coming to you with ideas, you can help sort of guide the ideas in a certain way without being the owner of the idea. And so that's a kind of idea of collaboration that I'm trying to think about as I work with people in the studio. It's a slightly different model. It doesn't give up this sense of a kind of vision which directs, but what it's trying to do is give up sort of ownership of that vision, direct ownership. But yeah, it's like there are a lot of ingredients in your refrigerator, and in the end, you take the ingredients and the ideas, but you try to put it together in a way that makes sense and tastes good for dinner. Speaking of dinner, maybe we should do, like, if there's one more question, do one more question, then call it a night.
Okay, is there another question in the middle, on the other side? We can pass the mic if there is. Someone want to, yeah, we've got one over there. Jennifer.
So my dear friend Jennifer is going to close out the night. You're going to throw me a softball?
Not likely.
You know, I know you so well. I am so appreciative of you. Billie came to Carleton in we're thinking 83, 84.
Before you were born, half the audience, but that's okay.
40 years ago, and influenced me deeply. And I'm so appreciative for that. I think I've never asked you, though, after a degree in art, what happened? How did you become an architect? Why did you become an architect?
It was a mistake. So I wanted to be a graphic designer because I thought that that was sort of more interesting. But I was in California and somebody said, well, UCLA has an architecture school and it's kind of like graphic design, which they were completely wrong. But I applied and got in, and as a Mark I student. So I understand all you Mark I students because you know nothing. But that's good because maybe you have a bigger sense of the world than people who've studied architecture, only architecture. And what I realized was I loved the culture. I just loved the culture of a studio where people are working together, not necessarily working on the same project sometimes, but you're working together to try to make something. And so in many ways, it wasn't architecture itself that drew me, it was the sort of culture of architecture. So the studio culture to me is one of the most important aspects of practice. So thank you, everybody, for sitting
Let's
here.
thank you. So everyone, thank you all for coming, and let's give Billie a great round of applause. I think that you can come down and speak casually with Billie. I know that Ben would like to add one last announcement. I was going to say see you all next year, but Ben is going to say something else.
We have a bonus lecture coming up Wednesday, April 3rd. I think it's at 5 o'clock, same place. This is Josh O'Kane. Some of you know him. He's a writer for the Globe and Mail. Wrote a book called Sideways. It's the story of Sidewalk Labs and the whole, can I quote Trump, covfefe related to the Google Sidewalks issue. So he'll be here to talk about that on Wednesday, April 3rd. So we look forward to seeing you then.